The hiss of meat on cast iron filled the Texas air like a gunshot. Kiyomi froze, steak tongs hovering above the flames. A cowboy had just handed them to her like it was nothing, like she wasn't the enemy, like she hadn't spent the last 3 years being told Americans would slice her apart like this meat. Behind her, the other women watched in stunned silence. The smoke curled skyward. A fly buzzed near the grill. Kiyomi's fingers trembled, and for a second she thought it was a joke, a trap, but the cowboy just tipped his hat and stepped back. "You burn it? You eat it," he said with a half-smile. She didn't know how to reply. She didn't even know if she was allowed to laugh. A POW flipping steak in Texas wasn't just unexpected. It was impossible. But now the impossible was sizzling in front of her, and for the first time since surrender, she wasn't sure who she was anymore. Kiyomi turned the steak, and the sizzle cracked like a whip in the still Texas air. Smoke curled up into the blue, and for a moment she stood still, tongs in hand, as if waiting for someone to shout that it was a mistake, that the enemy doesn't hand weapons, fire, blades, control to prisoners. But no voice came, just the lazy call of a crow from the fence post and the metallic clink of the tongs against the grill. She glanced sideways at the cowboy who'd given them to her. He wasn't watching her anymore. He was drinking lemonade in the shade, legs crossed like it was the most ordinary thing in the world for a Japanese prisoner of war to be cooking his lunch. She didn't know how long she stood there, but her hands began to move on instinct or memory. She couldn't say. She had never grilled steak before. Not like this. Not over flame. But she had fed her younger brother once, during the worst winter, roasting fish on a tin sheet behind their collapsed house in Nagoya. She'd burned it. He'd smiled anyway. The smell rising from the meat now was different, richer, heavier, but it hit the same part of her chest, sharp and deep. Behind her, she could feel eyes. The other women had gathered silently. Some were barefoot. Some still wore the same threadbare uniforms they had arrived in. No one spoke. They just watched, as if witnessing something holy or forbidden. One woman, Midori, maybe the one who had coughed blood on the ship, stood with her arms crossed tightly over her chest, staring at the steak like it was a ghost. Kiyomi turned the meat again. The fat hissed and popped. She adjusted the flame. Her heart was pounding. Fire had always meant danger, destruction. The crackle of wood used to mean the sky was falling. The planes had come. The bombs would follow. Now it was just lunch. Or maybe it was something else entirely. She wasn't sure yet. A second cowboy brought over plates. "You cook. We'll serve," he said with a wink. Kiyomi blinked, then nodded. One by one, the steaks came off the grill. She laid them gently on each plate like they were artifacts, not food. The smell filled the camp. Thick and unbelievable salt, smoke, sear. Women began to move forward, unsure. Midori was the first to take a plate. Her hands trembled as she accepted it. She didn't say thank you, just looked at Kiyomi for a moment, eyes glassy, then turned away. Then came Chiyo, and Aiko, and the others. Each one stepped forward, received their food, and stepped back into the shade like participants in some secret ceremony. No one asked questions. No one laughed. Not yet. But something had shifted. This wasn't stew handed out by guards. This was different. This was one of them, one of the Japanese feeding the rest. Leading. Holding the flame. She thought about that. The weight of the tongs in her hand. Back home, she wouldn't have been allowed to light a match without permission. Here, she had been handed a flame and told without words, "We trust you." It didn't feel like power. It felt like something more dangerous. Recognition. One woman reached out and gently touched Kiyomi's sleeve as she passed. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The line of women kept coming, solemn and silent, until all the plates were full. until all the meat was gone. Kiyomi stood, with the empty tongs in her hand and the smell of fire in her hair. She looked down at the grill, the blackened metal cooling now, and wondered what else the Americans might give her, what else she might be able to give back. That night, in the barracks, no one spoke about the meat. But the silence wasn't the same as before. It was heavier, softer. Kiyomi lay awake with the tongs still in her mind, not as a tool, not even as a weapon, but as a question. Back then, during the last cruel winter of the war, the only question Kiyomi asked was, how much longer? Her stomach growled so often it became background noise, like the wind or the distant hum of fighter planes. In the shell of their house on the outskirts of Nagoya, she had watched her mother boil bark, weeds, and once even an old leather sandal in desperation. They sipped the broth with cracked lips, pretending it tasted like miso. Her older brother, Satoshi, had already vanished into the army by then. No goodbye, just a uniform folded on the floor and a ration card left behind. The word steak meant nothing. It had no shape, no smell. It was an idea that belonged to cartoons or fairy tales, not to girls who scraped burnt rice off the bottom of dented pots. Kiyomi had not seen meat in nearly a year. She remembered once seeing a dog carcass in the alley and watching two boys fight over it with sticks. She turned away, but she had understood. Hunger made monsters of them all. She did not enlist in the Teishintai out of loyalty. She enlisted because they promised food, a ration cube a day, maybe two if you didn't faint during drills. At 16, her fingers were always cold, her eyes always scanning for something edible. The military barracks were made of paper and fear. Every morning began with a shouted pledge. Every evening ended with another girl collapsing during exercises. And still, they were told they were lucky. They had duties. They were part of the war effort. Her duties, it turned out, involved carrying buckets of blood and urine down hospital corridors slick with screams. The boys in the beds didn't look like heroes. They looked like broken dolls, torn limbs, hollow eyes. One of them, no older than Satoshi, had stared at her with such emptiness it made her drop the cloth she was holding. An officer slapped her for it. "Weakness is treason," he'd barked. She said nothing. She didn't even cry. She had learned that tears were useless when your stomach was louder than your voice. And the food, if you could call it that, tiny cubes of mashed millet, sometimes moldy, a ladle of broth that tasted like rust. Once, she received a sliver of dried fish as a reward for not fainting during inspection. She hid it in her pocket like treasure, afraid someone would steal it while she slept. At night, the girls whispered about what they missed: eggs, pickled plums, hot rice. Kiyomi didn't speak. She couldn't even remember what real food tasted like. Her hunger had erased the past. They were not allowed to imagine survival. Surrender was never spoken of, unless as a curse. Every pamphlet, every instructor, every film reel shouted the same thing: better to die on your feet than live on your knees. The code of Bushido was stamped into their mouths like ink on a seal. To cook for the enemy? Unthinkable. To eat their food? A betrayal. To survive capture? A disgrace. And yet, when the empire fell, it did so without warning. One day, there were orders. The next day, silence. The officers avoided their eyes. A nurse clutched a radio to her chest, crying soundlessly. The emperor's voice came through the static, thin and shaking. He said they must endure the unendurable. And just like that, everything Kiyomi had been told dissolved like paper in rain. She remembered folding her apron. She remembered the sound of footsteps in the hallway. But mostly she remembered how quiet it was, like the war had stepped out of the room and left them alone in the wreckage. She had thought the worst was yet to come. She believed that the Americans would finish what the firebombs had started, that they would laugh as they starved her, that they would take what little was left of her and grind it into dust. But the worst, it turned out, had already happened. The worst was being taught to starve and call it honor. The ship that carried Kiyomi away from Japan was painted gray and dull, but to her it looked like the inside of a coffin. She stepped onto the gangplank with a blank face, clutching the only thing she owned, an old kerchief she had used to tie her hair during hospital duty. Around her, other girls moved silently, their heads down, their steps uncertain. Some had lost shoes, others had lost hope. A few whispered prayers under their breath as the waves lapped against the hull. America was on the other side of the ocean, a word spoken like a curse, now made real by the creak of ropes and the engine's distant growl. No one told them where exactly they were going. The guards, American Marines, clean-shaven and oddly calm, didn't bark orders. They nodded. They counted heads. They opened the hatch and motioned the girls down into the belly of the ship. Kiyomi expected darkness, dampness, chains. Instead, she saw rows of bunks, each with a blanket folded at the end. A strange warm smell filled the space, not of sweat or sewage, but of food. Real food. She didn't believe it. The sea was unkind at first. Waves hit the hull like drums, and many of the girls grew pale with nausea. Buckets were placed nearby, and when Kiyomi stumbled with dizziness, a soldier handed her a tin cup of water without a word. She took it, blinking at the gesture. Back in Nagoya, water had been rationed, like gold. Here, it was given freely, like it meant nothing. The meals were worse in their kindness. Trays were passed out 3 times a day. Stew with potatoes and carrots, bread, soft and warm, apples that shone red in the low light of the ship's hold. Kiyomi could not eat the first meal. She held the spoon like it might cut her. She sniffed the stew. It smelled of salt and meat, of something real, something dangerous. When she took one sip, she gagged, not from the taste, but from memory. Her stomach twisted, her throat closed. She set the spoon down and pushed the tray away. The others whispered at night, curled on the thin mattresses. Was this a trick? Were they being softened before something worse? One girl said she'd heard the Americans did experiments on prisoners. Another claimed the food was poisoned, meant to make them docile. Kiyomi said nothing. She simply lay still, listening to the sound of the ship breathing its groans, its churn, the soft shuffle of boots above. Then came the soap. A guard led them to a room with hot water. Steam clung to the walls. Towels had been laid out. A woman handed Kiyomi a bar of soap, white, fragrant, smooth as ivory. She stared at it like it might disappear. She hadn't touched real soap in over a year. Washing was done with ash or nothing at all. She turned it over in her palm, unsure. When the water hit her back, hot and steady, she almost cried. Not from pain, from the shock of being clean. That night, her hair damp and her skin scrubbed raw, she caught her reflection in a piece of metal bolted to the wall. She looked like a ghost that had been given skin again. The soldiers never shouted. They sometimes smiled. One said, "Ma'am," when passing her in the corridor. Another handed her an extra apple. She didn't trust any of it. But something inside her, something buried and thin, whispered a terrible thought. What if they weren't monsters? By the time the ship neared the coast of America, that question had taken root. She stood on the deck one morning, staring at the mist beyond the waves, the shoreline slowly emerging like a dream. She had crossed an ocean not just in miles, but in meaning. From a land that taught her to die, to a land that at least for now was asking her to live. She didn't know yet what that meant. but she knew the world she came from could not explain the one she was stepping into. When the truck rolled to a stop on the Texas plain, the sky was too blue. That was Kiyomi's first thought. Blue, wide, and empty. No smoke, no ash, no screaming, just wind. Dry wind that smelled like hay, not gunpowder. The kind of wind that made her feel like she'd landed in someone else's dream. Dust rose around the tires as the guards called for the girls to get down. They moved slowly, unsure of their legs, unsure of the silence. The camp didn't look like a prison. It looked like a ranch. Wooden fences, horses in pens, a long building with chipped white paint and a rusted weather vane spinning lazily overhead. The guards wore hats, not helmets, plaid shirts instead of combat uniforms. One had a bandana tied around his neck like a character from a Western movie, the kind Kiyomi had once seen on a stolen reel before the war began. He smiled, not a sneer, not a warning, just a quiet nod, and handed her a comb. She stared at it. It was wooden, simple, with teeth slightly bent from use, but it was clean. He said nothing, just motioned toward a basin where other girls were washing their faces. Another American approached, tall, with sun-reddened cheeks, and placed a toothbrush in her hand. She looked down at it like it was a relic. He pointed toward a pump in the yard and mimed, brushing his teeth. Then he walked away. No yelling, no punishments, no suspicion. That night, Kiyomi sat on her bunk real cotton sheets, thinner than silk but warmer than the dirt floors she'd slept on back in Nagoya, and listened to the sounds around her. Crickets, a harmonica, distant laughter drifting from a farmhouse beyond the fence. Children's laughter. She turned her face to the wall, confused by how sharp that sound felt in her chest. It didn't belong here. She didn't belong here. Everything about the ranch felt like it had been built to confuse her. The food was hot beef stew again, the kind that clung to your ribs and made your body remember it was alive. A slice of bread still warm from the oven. A cup of something they called sweet tea. Kiyomi sipped it carefully, half expecting the warmth to turn bitter in her throat. It didn't. She set the cup down and stared at the steam rising from it. One girl beside her wept quietly as she chewed. No one stopped her. In the barracks, they were given clean clothes, plain, faded, but stitched whole. The fabric was soft, real cotton, not burlap or military issue. When Kiyomi slid the shirt over her head, she paused, unsure how to feel. She looked down at her arms, thin, but no longer shaking with cold. Her skin smelled faintly of soap. Not the sharp lye they used in the field hospitals, but something mild, something floral. That scent haunted her. She lay awake for hours inhaling it, afraid it would vanish by morning. What unsettled her most wasn't the comfort. It was the quiet. Back in Japan, silence was never safe. Silence meant bombs were coming, or someone was listening, or someone was about to strike. But here, it stretched around her like a blanket, not threatening, not empty, just still. She didn't know how to live in stillness. The Americans didn't leer. They didn't bark commands. They said strange things like, "Y'all sleep okay?" or "Let me know if you need anything," as if she had a choice, as if she was a guest, not a prisoner. Kiyomi nodded reflexively when they spoke, her eyes cast down, but inside her thoughts ran like a river in flood. Why aren't they angry? Why aren't they cruel? The girls whispered at night, some in disbelief, some in fear. One said maybe they were being fattened up for something. Another whispered that this was just the beginning, that the real punishment would come later. But even the most frightened among them admitted that, so far, nothing had made sense. Kiyomi stared at the comb resting beside her bunk. She had used it before dinner, running it slowly through her tangled hair, and for a few seconds she had seen her reflection in the glass of a window. Not a soldier, not a ghost, just a girl, standing on Texas soil and trying to understand how the enemy's hand could be so gentle. The mornings started with sunlight, not sirens. Kiyomi would blink awake to the sound of chickens clucking somewhere behind the mess hall and the faint rustle of wind in dry grass. It felt like waking inside someone else's life. She would sit up, stretch, and find every time that no one had come to scream her into motion. There were no drills, no barked orders, no punishments for sleeping 5 minutes too long. The routine was silent, voluntary, and that alone made it feel dangerous. The first time someone asked her to work, she flinched. A tall rancher with sunburned hands had appeared outside the barracks, shovel in one, rope in the other, and said in slow, clear English, "Help if you want. No pressure." Then he pointed toward a patch of earth near the barn. Kiyomi didn't move. She waited for the trick, but he just nodded, said, "Up to you," and walked off. She followed anyway, not because she trusted him, but because her limbs needed something to do. Carrying hay bales didn't make sense. Watering horses? That was something people did at home, not in captivity. She half expected to be mocked or laughed at, but no one watched her work. No one recorded her name on a chart. The ranch hands gave her space. Sometimes they offered water. Sometimes they offered nothing at all. And it was in that nothingness, the absence of control, of shame, that the confusion grew. By the end of the week, her muscles ached, but not from abuse, from effort, honest effort. She was eating twice a day now. Her ribs, once sharp enough to count, were softening. Her hands, which had trembled on the ship, grew steadier as she gripped the wooden shovel handle. Her skin didn't sag like paper anymore. Her reflection didn't look like a famine ghost. It looked like a girl who was remembering how to stand upright. That scared her more than anything, because while her body grew stronger, her beliefs, those deeply planted doctrines of shame, duty, obedience, began to wither in the sunlight. What did it mean to labor without fear? What did it mean to sweat because you chose to, not because you were being punished? In Japan, work had been about survival or subservience. Here, it was strangely neutral, even restorative. Kiyomi didn't know how to think about that. In the afternoons, the ranch glowed in a dusty haze. She would hear the radio playing inside the main house music she didn't recognize, all swing and joy. Sometimes a child would run by the edge of the property, chasing a dog. That dog would occasionally poke its nose through the barbed wire and sniff at the POWs with polite curiosity. No one chased it away. The camp was still fenced. Yes, there were rules. But the barbed wire didn't feel like a wall. It felt like a memory, one that didn't quite belong to the world she now stood in. One afternoon, she was hauling buckets of feed to the chickens when another girl, Reiko, stopped beside her and said softly, "Do you think they'll kill us later?" Kiyomi didn't answer. Not because she didn't have thoughts, but because she didn't know which thoughts belonged to her anymore. Her body didn't think it was going to die. It was digesting stew. It was gaining weight. It was sweating in the sun like a thing reborn. But her mind was slower to follow. Her mind still remembered the lectures, the promises of what Americans would do, the visions of torture, of revenge. Now all she had was a shovel, a sunburn, and a plate of food that didn't taste like fear. And that was more terrifying than any bullet. Because if the Americans were not the monsters she had been taught to hate, then what did that make the people who taught her? Who were the liars? And what, exactly, had she been starving for? The first time Kiyomi stepped near the kitchen tent, it wasn't to cook. It was to wash the dishes. She didn't even volunteer. Someone simply pointed to a pile of metal trays, and she nodded, too tired to resist. The water was lukewarm and murky by the third rinse, but the rhythm of it, dip, scrub, rinse, stack, soothed her in a way she hadn't expected. No one shouted if she missed a spot. No one timed her or counted her mistakes. When she finished, one of the American women working in the kitchen handed her a rag and said, "Thanks, sugar." Sugar. No one had ever called her that before. By the end of the week, she was peeling potatoes. Sitting on an overturned crate, her feet in the dirt, a basket beside her, she worked quietly, watching the skin curl off in thin ribbons. There were no knives allowed, only peelers, but even that felt like trust. Her hands moved faster than she thought they could. It was simple, and strangely satisfying. Then came the afternoon, when everything changed. It was hot, the air sticky with the scent of firewood and meat, when a cowboy with sunburned cheeks and kind eyes walked up holding a black skillet. His name was Luke. Kiyomi only knew him because he sometimes helped unload the food crates and always whistled when he walked. Today, he wasn't whistling. He just handed her the skillet and asked, "You ever cook meat?" She stared at the pan like he'd offered her a live grenade. Cook meat? She had barely seen meat. She didn't answer. Her hands trembled slightly, unsure whether this was some strange joke. But Luke just nodded toward the fire pit and said, "You want to try?" That word again. Try. Not obey. Not report. Not submit. Just try. She took the skillet. The fire crackled low, fed by dry wood, and a slab of beef sizzled on a nearby plate, still raw. Luke showed her how to angle the pan, how to hold it so the heat stayed even. Then he stepped back, not watching, not correcting, just letting her be. She placed the meat into the pan and flinched as it hissed. The sound was primal, alive. It crackled and popped, and the scent, rich, fatty, unreal, hit her like a memory she didn't know she still had. Her hands, once frail and thin, moved on their own. She flipped the meat, adjusted the heat. Somewhere inside her, buried under years of hunger and fear, a voice stirred. She was 6 again, sitting on a stool while her mother grilled fish over a broken gas burner in their tiny Nagoya kitchen. The fish skin blistered and crisped just like this. Her mother hummed an old song. The window was open. It had been spring. There had been wind chimes. The memory hit her so hard she nearly dropped the pan. But she didn't. She held on. By the time the steak was done, a small crowd had formed, mostly POWs, a few Americans leaning on fence posts. No one said anything, but someone handed her a plate. Someone else passed her salt. And Kiyomi, with hands that once carried hospital waste and wiped blood off floors, now carried a cooked steak to the table and placed it down. Just like that. She became the cook. Not officially. No one made an announcement, but word spread. The next day, she was asked to help again. The day after, she wasn't asked. She simply showed up. Someone had left a folded apron on the table for her. Food was no longer something to fear. Fire was no longer the enemy. The skillet had not burned her, it had woken her. And in that sizzling, sunlit corner of a Texas ranch, she stopped being just another number behind barbed wire. She became a girl with a pan. The next evening, word moved through the camp the way rumors always did, quietly at first, then all at once. The Japanese girl was cooking again. Not cleaning, not washing trays. Cooking. By the time the sun dipped low enough to cast long shadows across the yard, a small line had already formed near the fire pit. Women stood there, pretending not to wait. pretending they just happened to be nearby. Some folded their arms, some stared at the dirt, a few clutched tin plates with nervous hands. No one spoke. Kiyomi noticed them as she approached the fire. Her first instinct was to retreat. She had never cooked for an audience. In her old life, cooking had been quiet, private, done in corners with rationed ingredients, and fear crouched nearby. Now, eyes followed her. Not cruel eyes, curious ones, hopeful ones. She swallowed and stepped closer to the heat. The skillet was already warming. Someone had laid out cuts of meat beside it, thin, marbled, real. She picked up the tongs, feeling their weight settle into her palm. The sound of the fire filled the silence. When the first piece of meat touched the iron, the sizzle rose up like a voice. Heads lifted. Someone inhaled sharply. The smell spread, rich and undeniable. Kiyomi focused on the sound, the timing, the instinct in her hands. She remembered watching her mother cook on a small stove in their apartment, the way she'd tilt the pan just so, how she'd listen rather than look. She did the same now. The fire crackled, fat dripped, smoke curled toward the sky. For a moment, the camp disappeared. When she turned the steak, a murmur rippled through the line. A woman near the back laughed softly, a disbelieving sound. Another wiped her eyes. No one spoke, but something loosened in the air, like a knot being slowly untied. She plated the first piece and held it out. The woman who stepped forward hesitated, then accepted it with both hands, bowing her head slightly. Kiyomi nodded back without thinking. It felt natural. Right. One by one, the plates were filled. Each time, the ritual repeated acceptance, surprise, gratitude, disbelief. One woman pressed her palms together before eating. Another whispered something that sounded like a prayer. A cowboy leaned against a post nearby, arms crossed, watching with an unreadable expression. After a moment, he chuckled softly and shook his head. "I'll be damned," he muttered. "Best cook on the ranch." Kiyomi didn't hear him. She was too busy watching the faces in front of her. Women who had arrived hollow and hollow-eyed were chewing slowly, carefully, as if afraid the food might vanish if they hurried. Some smiled without realizing it. Others cried quietly, shoulders shaking, trying to hide their tears behind their hands. No one scolded them for crying. When the last plate was served, Kiyomi finally stepped back. Her arms ached. Her hands smelled of smoke and meat. She looked down at them, surprised by how steady they were. She had fed people, not as an order, not as a duty, but because she could. As dusk settled in, someone began to hum. A low, hesitant sound that wove between the flicker of firelight and the scrape of boots on dirt. Another voice joined in, then another. Soon the sound grew into something like a song, broken, imperfect, but alive. A harmonica joined in, wavering and sweet. Kiyomi sat on a crate, her back against the warm metal of the stove, listening. Laughter bubbled up unexpectedly from her chest. It startled her. She pressed a hand over her mouth, but it escaped anyway, light and unguarded. For the first time since the war began, the sound didn't feel dangerous. In that moment, she understood something she hadn't dared to name before. This wasn't just food. It wasn't charity or cruelty or strategy. It was connection. It was the simple, radical act of feeding one another and choosing not to be afraid. The war had taken so much from her, her home, her family, her sense of self. But here, beside a fire under a foreign sky, she felt something return. Not pride, not victory, humanity. And for the first time since the world had collapsed, she believed it might be possible to build something again, starting with a meal shared in the open air, under a sky that, at last, felt wide enough to breathe beneath. The day the guards handed out paper, it felt like another test. "Write home if you want," they said casually, as if it were nothing, as if the very idea of communicating with Japan, the world she'd buried under war, loss, and silence, could be picked up and held in a pencil. Kiyomi stared at the blank sheet for a long time. Around her, the other women did the same. One woman gripped the pencil so tightly it snapped. Another folded the page into squares and tucked it away like a secret. What could they possibly say? And who would believe them? Kiyomi's hand hovered, uncertain. Then she wrote, "I cooked steak today. For Americans. They called me ma'am." She paused. That one word, ma'am, looked like a typo on the page. It didn't belong next to her name. It was something American women heard. Not girls from Nagoya who had carried bandages soaked in blood and whispered their apologies to dying soldiers. But that was what the cowboy had said, clear as daylight. He'd tipped his hat and said, "Damn good, ma'am." She added one more line. I smiled. Then I cried. "I don't know why." She signed her name. Not her number, not her rank, not her title from the Teishintai. Just Kiyomi. The letter never made it to Japan. American intelligence intercepted all outbound communication from POW camps. Red Cross agents read them too. Her message, instead of landing in her mother's trembling hands, landed on a desk in Washington, where it was translated and filed under anomalous civilian testimony. But the real power of that letter wasn't in who read it. It was in the act of writing it. Because when Kiyomi handed it over, the guard didn't flinch. He didn't crumple it or mock her. He just nodded and added it to the growing pile. And when she returned to the mess tent that evening, she found something new waiting for her. An apron. It wasn't standard issue. It had been sewn by hand slightly crooked, patched with different shades of canvas. Across the front, stitched in red thread, was her name, Chef Kiyomi. At first, she thought it was a joke, a cruel one. But then Luke appeared behind her, grinning. "Figured it was time you got promoted." She held the apron like it was made of silk. Her breath caught in her chest. For a moment, she didn't know whether to laugh or run. Instead, she cried. Not the soft, polite tears of a quiet girl in public, but deep sobs that shook her shoulders and made her lean against the table for support. No one interrupted. One woman stepped forward and gently touched her back. Another stood beside her in silence, because they all understood what it meant to be called by name again, to be seen, not as a soldier, not as a number, not as a prisoner, but as something else entirely, a person. Later that night, Kiyomi sat alone by the fire. The harmonica music drifted from the barracks. The stars were sharp above her, Texas-wide and impossible to count. She wore the apron around her waist. Her hands were still stained with smoke and grease. But she didn't wipe them clean. She wanted to remember this. She wanted to remember that once, in the middle of history's most brutal war, someone gave her a skillet, a name, and a piece of thread, and that somehow, impossibly, that had been enough to start healing. Are you finding this story as powerful as we do? If so, please like the video and drop a comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from. We'd love to hear your thoughts. On her final week at the ranch, the smell of smoke came earlier than usual. Kiyomi had risen before the sun, her boots crunching frostbitten grass as she walked to the grill. This time, she wasn't alone. A group of women followed her, not out of duty, but because they wanted to help. One chopped onions, another arranged loaves of bread, a third carefully measured out salt into little paper bowls. There were no orders, no schedules, only rhythm and memory. That day, Kiyomi was cooking for everyone. Not just the women who had once been prisoners like her, but the guards, the ranchers, the cowboys, even the nurses. A cowgirl named Anna joined her at the fire. Sleeves rolled up, straw hat tugged low over her eyes. She flipped steaks like a gunslinger and said, "You running the show today, chef." Kiyomi smiled, and for once didn't flinch at the title. The fire burned hot, the grill hissing, metal shining like armor. She moved between stations with quiet precision. Hands that once trembled over rice rations now lifted slabs of meat and dropped them onto iron without fear. When the smoke rose into the sky, it didn't feel like a warning. It felt like incense, sacred. The scent curled through the camp, waking sleepers, drawing out laughter. Women brushed their hair. Men straightened their collars. Something was happening, and everyone knew it. Around noon, the line stretched longer than she had ever seen. Children from the nearby ranch arrived with their parents, bringing jars of lemonade and baskets of corn. Someone pulled out a guitar. A nurse brought chairs. No one called it a celebration, but it was. When Kiyomi handed out the first plate, she noticed the silence. Not fear, but reverence. The act of being fed by someone who had once been called the enemy had become a kind of communion. People chewed slowly. They made eye contact. They said, "Thank you." It was then that the American woman she never learned her name walked up and placed something by her feet. A pair of worn but sturdy boots, polished, laced, waiting for after, the woman said softly. Kiyomi blinked. "After?" she asked, voice barely a whisper. The woman only smiled and walked away. After. The word hit her like a stone dropped in water. What came after this? She had been taught that surrender was the end, that there was no after, no honor, no identity. That survival itself was shame. But here she was, grilling meat, laughing, feeding cowboys and children, wearing an apron with her name on it. No rifles, no alarms, no one watching her with suspicion, just smoke and sky. She looked up. The clouds moved like they had always moved, untouched by war or ideology. For the first time, she imagined her body existing not as a weapon or a servant, but as a vessel for something else. Something like peace, something like hunger, not for food, but for living. That night, after the fire had died down and the last dish had been scrubbed, Kiyomi returned to the bunkhouse. The women were quiet. A few slept with their arms draped over each other like sisters. Someone was humming. Her cot waited, simple and worn. But beneath it, the boots sat like an invitation. She didn't try them on. She didn't have to. She reached down, pulled them close, and whispered, "I want to live, not survive. Live. Tomorrow, she would step toward a world she didn't understand, a country that had defeated her own, a future that made no promises. But tonight, the smoke had risen not from bombs, but from firewood, and that was enough. The morning of departure arrived without ceremony. No sirens, no speeches, just the low rumble of trucks and the rustle of canvas as the camp stirred awake. Kiyomi stood at the edge of the yard, the same place where she had first held a pan, where smoke had risen like a question into the sky. The air was cool, the kind that settles gently on the skin instead of biting it. She wore the same plain clothes she had worn the day before, but something in her posture had changed. Her shoulders were straighter, her steps steadier. She was no longer shrinking from the world. When they called her name, she answered without flinching. She had been weighed that morning. 104 pounds. The number meant little to her, but the way the medic nodded told her everything. She was no longer disappearing. Her cheeks had filled. Her eyes no longer darted. She stood with the quiet certainty of someone who had learned how to exist again. In her satchel, she carried only a few things: the apron, folded neatly, a harmonica given to her by one of the cowboys, and the letter she had written but never sent, the one that said everything and nothing at all. She kept it tucked between the folds of fabric, close to her chest, as if the words might still be listening. The truck that would take her to the port idled nearby. A few of the ranch hands stood off to the side, hats in their hands. They didn't speak much. There was nothing left to explain. When she approached, one of them stepped forward and held out something wrapped in cloth. It was the tongs, the same ones she had used that first day. The metal was darkened from fire, the handle worn smooth where her fingers had gripped it. She stared at them, uncertain, then looked up. "For the road," the man said quietly. "Figured you earned 'em." She took them with both hands. For a moment, she couldn't speak. The weight of the metal was familiar, comforting. It felt like holding proof of something that had once seemed impossible. She bowed her head slightly, not out of obligation, but gratitude. He tipped his hat in return. As she turned to leave, she caught sight of the others watching, the women she had cooked for, the ones who had eaten and laughed and cried beside her. One of them lifted a hand in farewell. Another mouthed her name. Kiyomi stepped onto the truck. The engine rumbled to life. As it began to roll forward, she lifted the tongs not in triumph, not in defiance, but in acknowledgement, a quiet gesture, a signal understood only by those who had stood by the fire with her. The road stretched ahead, pale and dusty. Beyond it waited a country still broken, still aching, a homeland she no longer recognized. But she was not returning as she had left. She was not empty. She was not silent. She carried something no one could take from her now. She carried the memory of standing over a flame and choosing to feed others instead of shrinking away. As the truck disappeared down the road, the wind carried the scent of smoke one last time. Not the smoke of burning cities or falling bombs, but the gentle trace of a fire used to cook, to gather, to live. She did not know what waited for her on the other side of the ocean. She only knew this: she had survived not by becoming harder, but by remembering how to care. And that, she realized, was its own kind of victory. If this story moved you, please like the video and tell us where you're watching from. Thank you for remembering a piece of history that refused to be forgotten.